to the meeting now, so we'll get started in just a minute, and we'll ask some of our folks in the background, Lucy or Corey, when it looks like we've got most of our folks in the meeting, just let me know and we'll get going. Okay, it looks like our participant list is slowly slowing down, so we're not getting dozens of people started. So we're going to go ahead and get going because we've only got an hour. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm so glad that you're with us. My name is Jeff Merchant. I'm the Executive Director of Better Utah. I'm glad to have everyone on for this post-election panel. And as you know, this election has been described as many different things, from terrifying to relieving, depending on what your perspective is. And while a lot has happened at the national level, that will have repercussions across the United States and across the world, frankly, here in Utah, we've had a lot of very interesting local electoral action as well, that has arguably cost Republicans and Democrats and many other organizations lots and lots of money, but arguably didn't do much to change, the makeup of the electoral makeup of the state before we had election day and afterwards. So to talk about all these developments in Utah, what may have happened, what didn't happen, what we thought might happen, and what ultimately did or didn't happen, we have three of my favorite reporters here in Utah to talk about things. So the first person that we have is Robert Gehrke. He's a longtime fixture of political reporting here in Utah. He's been here for more than 20 years covering government and politics, both in Utah and throughout the Western United States. We have Katie McKellar, who covers government, Utah government issues. She's a senior reporter at a great new online newspaper, the Utah News Dispatch. She specializes in the legislature and the government and the governor, and does a lot of work on housing and growth and homelessness. Thank you for being here. And then, of course, we've got Sage Miller, who does politics and government as a reporter at KUER. She's also the co-host of the fabulous podcast State Street. So thank you for being here as well. I appreciate all three of you being willing to come and talk to Better Utah and folks that we work with. So I wanted to start with this question, which is, what is the most surprising thing that happened in the electoral cycle this year? Were there standout races, upsets, trends that you noticed, anything like that? And Katie, maybe we'll start with you. What did you find surprising?
Well, to me, the most surprising thing that happened in Utah elections this year was what ended up not being on the ballot. Amendment A and D was just, it was wild. Like, I don't know about you, Gehrke or Sage, but I have never seen anything like that happen here in Utah, to have actual questions voided. Amendment D, especially, people that I feel like don't normally pay attention to politics or news were paying attention to what happened with Amendment D because it was so wild. And so I had peers that were actually reading those stories that normally don't pay attention to politics. And so to me, that was the most wild thing that happened this election, but no one ended up voting on it. So
Yeah, we don't know what the results are. We don't know anything about what happened. They were both on the ballot, but
yeah.
No results. So interesting.
Mhm.
Sage, how about you? Anything interesting?
Definitely agree with Katie. Amendment A and D being voided was a whirlwind. And I'm excited to have a break from Supreme Court hearings for a minute. But I think aside from that, there was a lot of talk that perhaps Democrats would perform better this year than they have in previous years, perhaps flip a few seats in the state legislature. And they picked up one but then also might have lost Rosemary Lesser's seat in Ogden. So essentially it's a wash, right? There's no net gains. So I will say it's kind of twofold. One, Rosemary Lesser losing her seat, I think was kind of, or she hasn't completely lost it yet, but like kind of on the verge of losing to her Republican opponent, I think kind of shook up some things. And some people there was mumblings that redistricting is one of the main reasons why she was less likely to maybe secure that seat after the 2020 redistricting cycle. But additionally, the margins for Democrats in some of these key battleground districts, i.e. on the west side of Salt Lake County, the margins actually grew more in favor for Republicans. So whereas in 2022 and 2020, the results were a lot closer, like Anthony Lubasi and I think House District 30 won by like less than 100 votes, and now he's more than 100 votes above his opponent. So I think that there's more ground that Democrats need to make up, especially in these swing districts, if they want to try and chip away at the supermajority. But I think it was probably pretty demoralizing for them to not have a more fruitful election cycle this year.
Yeah, and we're going to talk, I think, a lot more about that in a few minutes. But before we do, Robert, anything that you found particularly interesting or surprising?
Yeah, first off, thanks for having me, and sorry you get me in my casual gear today. I'm on a big deadline, so I've been writing all day and didn't have time to clean up.
You're just a little bit quiet, Robert, just so
Okay,
that you're
well,
aware. Is it that?
All right, I'll try to speak up.
Okay.
I guess I would echo what Sage said. You know, the biggest surprise in my mind was sort of the lack of surprises. You know, there were a lot of dynamics coming into this race that would indicate that this was going to be sort of an exceptional election. And it just didn't really pan out the way that I think we expected it to. I think Amendment D being stricken from the ballot was, you know, that had the potential to really drive a huge turnout, have a big backlash against the legislature, because that was this ballot initiative proposal was a major it cut across party lines. Republicans, Democrats, and independents all like the ballot initiative process, and they want to have access to that. And the legislature, you know, I think maybe with some hubris, was going to undo that. That had the potential to really drive turnout. But then when it got stricken, I think the court perhaps threw the legislature a bit of a lifeline, and saved some seats that might otherwise have been in jeopardy. So as Sage mentioned, picking up the one seat, losing one seat, it's a wash. The supermajority remains intact. And I would just kind of drilling down a little bit more to Salt Lake County. You know, it looked like Zach Robinson might be able to pull out that win over Dia Theodore on election night, but that margin got bigger. They held their seats. Natalie Pinckney held the seat that Jim Bradley had been retiring from. So the Republican majority stays intact there as well. So all in all, it's sort of like, what if we threw an election and nothing changed kind of scenario.
Yeah, I think that that's really true. You've raised a couple of things that I think we're going to end up talking about, particularly around you know, what the legislature might do as we look into 2025. But before we get there, let's kind of pick up on this theme about, you know, a whole lot of nothing happening, right? I mean, it looks like, despite Democrats, as you mentioned, Sage, a lot of hope that there would be a lot of change, that, you know, we picked up a seat, we lost a seat in terms of the Democratic Party. It looks like at the county level, as you mentioned, Robert, there's still going to be a 5-4 majority for Republicans, though Jenny Wilson did expand her electoral victory over what she had when she ran a couple of years ago. Why do you think the stalemate exists? I mean, obviously there is some kind of a stalemate. Is it that redistricting has created a scenario in which Republicans have just won as much as they can and they can't get any more? The same thing applies to Democrats. Why do you think that we have this stalemate, especially at a time when it looks like if you were to poll people, you ask people, I mean, there's this big report that came out earlier this year that said one of the biggest things that Utahns don't like is having politicians that don't listen to them. And yet we've got kind of the same politicians that we've always had running things. Why do you think there's a stalemate?
I will say one thing is that if we are looking at it kind of broadly, like Kamala Harris garnered the most votes a Democratic presidential candidate has essentially ever since we elected a Democratic president in 1967. That was LBJ. So we do see some of the needles moving a tiny bit, right? Like they really are chipping away when it comes to more Democratic support, maybe statewide, as you mentioned with Jenny Wilson. But I do think part of the stalemate is redistricting for sure. I think they've made it less competitive for Democrats to try and secure some of the seats both in the state legislature and in the congressional maps. But additionally, one of the big things that Democrats, at least, and I've talked to like Democratic insiders about this, is that they have a really hard time connecting with voters and having good quality candidates run against these people that may be potentially popular. So a good example that I have talked about this past election cycle, and the one that the Democrats flipped in the state legislature was House 30. My bad, Lube is House 27. And that's Jake Fittipaldi. And Jake Fittipaldi is on the West Valley City Council. And he has kind of worked his way up the ladder within the Democratic Party to run this seat. And I went out canvassing with him for a story that didn't end up running, but I was kind of curious what voters on the West Side were thinking about the days leading up to the election. And as we're knocking on doors, like he knew everybody's name, everybody knew him. He speaks Samoan, Spanish, Portuguese, and English. And so he really kind of embodies that district and kind of the cultural melting pot that it does exist. And so I think part of the stalemate is people just aren't enthusiastic about Democratic candidates at all, and they need to do a better job investing in recruiting in them. But I also think, yes, a huge part is going to be redistricting. And as those maps go back through the courts, Democrats could see a win. But at this time, I think even though they're chipping away, they do need to do a better job of like connecting with the voter. And I think that's a big part of it, especially when you have the Republicans kind of dominating the trifecta of the state. So,
Katie, I mean, do you think that it's only a redistricting thing? I mean, we did see up in Montana this year with new redistrict, with new maps, the Democrats did make some gains despite some national losses. But I mean, do you think Democrats have a shot at really, I mean, beyond redistricting, really being able to convince people that their message works?
I mean, it's a good question. With one of the things that stuck out to me about this election too was the number of independents. And I think combined with redistricting and this long-standing like difficulty of Democrats in Utah to get some ground, there's been some effort to try to reach out to those unaffiliated voters or independent voters. We saw a lot of independent candidates this year. But they did okay. They didn't do as well as they were hoping for. None of those races panned out. So I think that's kind of an element. Like if there's this group of people trying to reach out to people that just are kind of turned off by partisan politics, that might also be an obstacle standing in the way of Democrats. If they see you're a Democrat, they just don't want to engage because everything is so partisan. And I feel like with the election results this year, and with the national climate trickling down, it was a very partisan year. People just kind of stuck to their corners and their tribes, and independents couldn't really break through that either. So if Democrats can find a way, like what Sage said, to reach out to more people and to connect with more voters who have otherwise just not been interested, I think that's an element here, is this frustration with partisan politics.
Yeah, it's interesting. I participated in an interesting focus group, and it seemed like the people that we were talking to, they don't necessarily like Republicans or Democrats. They really thrive on this idea of having unaffiliated candidates. If that's the case, I mean, Robert, what are your thoughts? If people don't like either party, why didn't this independent movement gain more steam? Because it doesn't seem like it really got much of anything, right? Like people didn't seem to come closer. It wasn't like people lost by a half a point, they lost by the same amount the Democrats lose by.
Yeah, I mean, that was probably the most striking thing to me is that, I thought the idea was interesting. We saw Evan McMullin do much better in the Senate race 2 years ago than a Democrat has done for a long, long time. I think if you go back, you have to go back to when Ted Wilson ran against Orrin Hatch, if I'm not mistaken, or maybe it was, but so the strategy seems sound, but also what McMullin had that these independents didn't was about $9 million from national organizations to spend money and get his name out there. So I think that, money is still important, name ID is still important in these races. But I think to Katie's point, I agree that, this was an election where the partisan norms kind of held, and those independents only did a couple points better. I think Patrick Belmont did like 3 points better than the Democrat did 2 years ago. And so I don't know if it's a strategy that we'll see repeated or an attempt to repeat it. I think it does have some promise, but I also think it didn't show the results that we would expect it. But it also, to Sage's point, I think it is a function of gerrymandering in a lot of ways. I mean, I haven't looked at this past cycle, but traditionally speaking, about 95% of the legislative seats are not competitive. I mean, there's so the margins are very narrow, and we do see every 10 years, that there's the redistricting period, and then Democrats get knocked down, they lose, 3 to 5 to sometimes 6 seats, and then chip away at that over the ensuing 10 years, and then there's another redistricting period, and they get knocked back to square one. So I think this election again kind of broke down along traditional partisan lines. And I think that's especially evident if you look at the statewide races where you have a candidate like Brian King, who's a reasonably well-known candidate. He's established, he's a legitimate candidate, spent a decent amount of money and got the exact same percentage as the treasurer candidate who didn't spend any money and isn't well-known. So, that shows me that it people, when they go to mark their ballots, fall into those traditional buckets that they always have. And if you talk to pollsters in the state, people like Quinn Monson, people who identify as independent or unaffiliated oftentimes are actually affiliated. And it may be a little bit less in this state because of the closed Republican primaries, but they do have traditional tendencies that end up ruling the day at the end of the day. So I think, I think that was sort of what was driving driving this election toward the norm.
I do wonder though if there were this number of independents in a non-presidential election year, if it would be as partisan. That's what I'd be curious to see if this independent movement continues, maybe in 2 years. If there's the same amount of independent candidates on the ballot, if they still target some competitive races, if they could do better. That to me would be interesting, but I really do think it was a factor of a presidential race of why people were so partisan. Because yeah, Gehrke's right. Like there are unaffiliated voters that have tendencies to vote in partisan ways, but I do know there is also a interest in an independent movement. So I would be curious to see if there would be something different maybe in 2 years.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. I think if there was not a presidential race at the top of the ticket, and maybe if there was a strong independent at the top of the ticket as well, it could create a little bit more of a tailwind. The other race that I think we could point to show that, again, we fell back into these traditional voting patterns is the Attorney General's race, where Michelle Quist ran as a United Utah Party candidate, campaigned pretty hard, spent some money, and ended up not making much of a dent, whereas Rudy Batista, who didn't spend any money and barely campaigned, ended up, about where you would expect a Democrat running in that race to end up.
Yeah, I thought that was actually really interesting. I think that race kind of highlighted that more than almost any other. But it is interesting when you have candidates who spend very little money and end up in the exact same spot that the candidates before them have. And I think that it really does kind of go to this idea that even though people like the idea of independence. Maybe when push comes to shove, they're not quite as independent as they claim to be. There's a lot of research also that just shows that these folks are afraid of throwing their vote away. They're afraid that if they vote for an unaffiliated candidate, that it means that that their vote isn't going to really count. Which, of course, there's an irony to that, because if everybody voted for the unaffiliated candidate, they wouldn't be throwing their vote away. But I do think that there's some interesting issues that hopefully we'll be able to continue to see with the independent movement here. That's a movement that's happening all over, especially in the Western United States. So we might continue to see some of that in 2026. Robert, you said something I thought was interesting about Evan McMullin and about $9 million coming into the state. We actually had a decent amount of outside state money come in, particularly in some Democratic races, including Rosemary Lesser's race. Rosemary right now, keeping in mind, everybody, that we haven't got a final canvas yet. There are some changes that could happen. Unlikely at this point that races will move very much, but there's always a possibility, I suppose. It looks like she's going to lose by about just under 300 votes. But as has been reported, there was a very large effort on issues surrounding trans issues, right? Men going into bathrooms, boys playing against girls in sports. This outside money looks like, at least at this point, we don't know exactly how much was spent. They haven't really been reporting correctly, but it was pretty negative. I mean, does negative campaigning work in Utah? Is that something that you think was a real factor in Rosemary's race in particular, but maybe some of these other Democratic races? Because there were mailers, text messages, even some canvassing. I heard yesterday, someone reported to me that up in Weber County, there were people canvassing on these issues. How does negative campaigning work in Utah?
Yeah, there's this sort of conventional wisdom that, we have more genteel politics here in Utah. And I don't think that's necessarily been the case, as much as people like to think it is, that negative campaigning happens in Utah, and it happens because it works. If it didn't work, they'd stop doing it. Now you can go overboard and, alienate people. But I think particularly on those trans mailers, that's an emotional appeal, right? And it's hard to combat that, because there's not a good soundbite for rebutting something like that. And that's why I think it was effective both in Rosemary's case, and also, we saw it in President Trump's campaign ads as well. It's got a strong emotional appeal. There's a emotional reaction to it, and whether or not, as when we saw Governor Cox point out that there were 4 women at the time who wanted to compete in high school sports, it's not the most pressing issue in voters' minds, but it is effective, and so I think you'll see more of it. And I should also add, I think we are seeing more of it, just because as the national political dialogue gets more corrosive and vitriolic, I think that is also reflected in the political debates we have here in this state.
Yeah. Katie, thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, it works. I think we saw with Phil Lyman's campaign too, with governor, that was a lot of negative campaigning. In the primary, he had probably a closer margin than some people might have been expecting. Of course, he still lost, so maybe that's an indicator that doesn't work as well in Utah as it does in like the national scope. But as a write-in candidate, he still got as a write-in, like a pretty decent number of voters, like 100,000 or something. And that goes to, like, I think I do wonder if we'll continue to see an increased level of negative campaigning here in Utah as Utah voters get used to it more on the national level, and we see it more and more here in Utah. I do wonder if the next elections will be as negative if it's not a presidential year, but a lot of negative campaigning this year. And it does work to some extent, but at some point I do think there are some limits here in Utah. Like Gehrke said, we have a genteel voter base.
Yeah.
If I could add before, sorry, Sage, but if I could just add, I think the limits that I think what voters don't react to is if it's a personal attack on a candidate or their family or something like that. Unfortunately, I think trans kids are an easy target for the Republicans to attack, and I think, you know, they were not shy about doing so, and you know, again, it's a hard argument or a hard attack to defend against.
Yeah. Sage, it looks like you're about to say something. Let me just, you can say what you're going to say, but also think about this in terms of this negative campaigning. Do you think that it's national folks coming in to try and affect things? Do you think that it's local people, local candidates, or, you know, organizations doing it? I don't know if you have any sense of that.
The first one, to like kind of respond to Katie, where she said that I think there are some limits to this negative campaigning, and I definitely think it depends on the district that you're in. Maybe if you're in more of a swing district, those more emotional appeals, those more negative ads showing the record of what they voted on might be more palatable to people who are on the fence of who they should vote for, especially in local races that aren't getting as much attention as the governor or as the president or the Senate race. But I live in Salt Lake County. I live in Salt Lake City specifically, and my representative is Jen Daly Provo, who is a Democrat. And I was getting mailers about her votes in support of allowing trans kids to play in sports. And she won by 70%. Like those mailers did not make a dent in the amount of support.
They may have done the opposite, right?
Yeah, they may have done the opposite, right? So it was maybe and I'm pretty sure that the people who were sending out those ads were a national group. And when you see a lot more of kind of these, like, I guess you would call them like egregious mailers, they usually are a national PAC who are sending them out. And the candidates don't know about that, right? So if a candidate says, oh yes, I want a PAC to help me, then they no longer have any contact with that PAC, right? Like they don't know really what's being sent out until it's maybe sent to them or a constituent tells them or whatnot. And we saw that happen in 2022 against Claire Collard and Anthony Loubet. Anthony Loubet ends up winning by like 67 votes, but it ended up kind of becoming like a negative ad campaign where a national PAC was sending negative nailers about Claire Collard, and then Claire Collard actually ended up getting a local PAC here to send negative pressers about Anthony Loubet. So I think it's a little bit of both. And like when I talked to Representative Loubet about it, he was like, I had no idea these were being sent out until like I got a negative campaign about, like a negative ad campaign about myself. And so I do think it's kind of like a hodgepodge, and they don't necessarily know either. But I do think that they will continue to play a role in politics as they always have.
And
Yeah.
before we move on, I just think that it's a lot harder to get somebody to vote for something than to get somebody to vote against something, right? So getting people out to the polls because they want to vote for a candidate, vote for hope, vote for change, whatever. It's a lot easier to get them to the polls if they're pissed off and want to punish somebody. So I think that's a truism, has been for a long time in politics, and will continue to be so.
Yeah, and I think that was a huge element with this election as far as like we saw how much support, you know, on the national level that Trump and Republicans got this year. Your question about, you know, will negative campaigning continue, or will there be more of it? I think given that Trump won, so clearly that's an indicator that yes, it does work. And you know, we saw you know, Trump-esque candidates like you know, Trent Staggs and Phil Lyman kind of mirror that type of style. And it worked for Trump this year. So they're going to try, I'd guess that we'll see more of it in the future too, here in Utah.
Yeah, it seems like that's probably the case. Now, this kind of raises an interesting question in my mind as we've been talking about trans issues specifically. And we know that Republicans use this all over the country. It was not just a Utah thing. But are we kind of seeing kind of a flipping of the old adage that all politics is local? Is all politics national now? It seems like trends in a lot of places, Utah included, tend to follow what happens nationally. But do you think that? I mean, do you think that local issues really matter to voters anymore?
It
you know, I
definitely-
think about Yeah, go
It
ahead.
definitely feels like it's more national than local these days. And maybe
Yeah,
that's
it
a
does.
presidential year, but yeah, it seems like more people seem to care more about what's happening on a national level, which is ironic because, what impacts you the most is what happens in your city councils and your counties, and your state. So, yeah, I mean, I'd hope we'd get back to a little bit more local focus, but that's how, I mean, with social media, with the national landscape, it just everything feels very national right now.
Yeah. I mean, what do you think the reasons for that are? I mean, we've seen a lot of consolidate. I mean, all three of you work, in the news. We've seen a lot of consolidation of national news organizations. Obviously, at the same time, we've seen social media explode. I could tomorrow, without any real training in journalism, become a political influencer on Twitter or whatever, or I guess X now, whatever, it doesn't matter who you are, right? Like anybody can, and it doesn't even matter if it's real. Are these factors part of the reason why everything's becoming nationalized? Are there other reasons for that? And is there a way to stop that? Is there a way to help people recognize that, picking up the trash each week is probably more important than some of these big national issues that are being brought in by big national organizations? Any thoughts on that?
I think with this election specifically, it really was very hyper focused on things that cannot be fixed fixed locally, right? So the number one thing on the top of the ticket, right, was the economy. There's no way that the Salt Lake City Council can curb inflation. Maybe they can take specific steps in order to help the burden in the pocket, but at the end of the day, they're really looking at national leaders in order to fix these issues. Another really big thing was the border. We're not necessarily a border state. We may have migrants coming in, but we're not seeing the influx that you would see in Arizona, Texas, or California. And so I think that there are kind of some burdens that to make it get back to the idea that all politics are local. But this year, yeah, I think Katie's just right, that it was a presidential year. People really cared about things that were happening on the national circuit. And even when somebody just put in the chat housing regulations, yeah, the city council and county council and the state can do that for absolutely. And that's something that you would look at maybe your local government for. And while housing was a very big deal, people were still looking at the national circuit to figure out how to solve the affordable housing problem, or even just the housing problem in general. And even when you look at the state government, when looking at that issue, there's still a stalemate. People don't want to change zoning laws. They don't want certain housing in their neighborhood. And so you do have a lot of these other obstacles to overcome. And even if you are the greatest candidate, at the end of the day, you still have to work with people in order to solve those problems. And not everybody's going to be on the same page.
Yeah. Okay. Well, did you want to add anything to that, Robert?
Yeah, I just had a couple thoughts. I think that yes, the presidential election sucked all the oxygen out of the room and made it really hard. And plus there was so much money spent on it that it created sort of so much noise that it was hard for other candidates to talk about the issues they wanted to. I think even locally, our policy making has become nationalized through groups like ALEC, and groups that want to run abortion measures or anti-trans measures. Those are being driven by out-of-state interests or national groups. And so the policy making, the policy discussions we're having then get reflected in the local political discussions we have. And I guess the third point I would make is it's maybe not quite as Spencer Cox, for example, the biggest issue he was talking about, I think, was affordable housing. He wants to have 35,000 starter homes in 5 years. That's his big talking point. And then lowering taxes, which I think is a national issue, but also a local issue. So I think, there are candidates who did talk about more local issues. But, yeah, the immigration issue in particular is one where Utah back in 2008 was bucking the national trend, right? And we were more seen as more immigrant friendly in this state. And now we've kind of come in line with the other states that are, more in favor of mass deportations, for example. So I think that things have changed here. I think they've changed nationally, this nationalization of the political dialogue that's trickling into our capital. And going forward, I think, maybe in 2 years when we don't have a presidential election, those local issues will be a little bit more central. But I think that's what was driving it this time around.
Yeah. Well, with that, let's talk a little bit about what we think is going to start happening in 2025. And then we've got a number of questions. We'll try and get some of those to you as well. But doesn't seem like there's been a lot of shift. If we talk about the legislature, our state politics, it looks like we're going to be going into the 2025 legislature with essentially very similar leadership, very similar makeup. What do you think is going to happen? I mean, are they, as a legislature specifically, going to start bringing up the issues that they didn't get raised this year with Constitutional Amendment A and D? What are the things we have to look forward to? Tax cuts? What are your thoughts?
I think Amendment D is going to come back in a new way. When the House and Senate had their Republican leadership elections recently, it was one of our first questions. And yeah, they're going to try again. They did express that, both the House Speaker and Senate President said that they, missteps were made. They acknowledged when it came to actually writing the ballot language. So if we do see Amendment D come back in a different form, I think they might have to be a bit more frank. And they'll also have to, figure out the publishing requirements, since they didn't put them in newspapers. That was also a second element of why A and D was voided. So that we'll be watching for that in the next session. And also, I'd be interested to see if there's any action taken against the judiciary to make tweaks. We've heard some lawmakers upset with the courts. Who knows what that will actually entail, what they'll actually do. And the House Speaker said it might take multiple years if they make any major changes to the judiciary. And then during leadership elections, they talked about, they'll focus again on energy independence, water, education, stuff like that. It's kind of more of the same.
Yeah.
I know a few things that they're probably not going to do. One of our reporters with KUER, Macy Limpkin, talked to Kara Birkland, who has been the sponsor of a lot of these controversial bills regarding LGBTQ youth. She was the author behind the trans bathroom bill. And she was also a very loud supporter of the restrictions on gender affirming care for minors and the sports bill. Anyway, she says that there is no plans to bring back any trans related legislation this session. If they were, I'd be very curious to see what it is. I feel like they've kind of checked all the boxes at this point. I don't know what else you could do. We also heard that there's not going to be as much legislation focused around the Great Salt Lake. They feel like things have been pretty sufficient, and they may tweak on some stuff with like groundwater. I think that's been a pretty big concern for the legislature. As it comes with air quality, there's been a few every year. There's a slew of bills related to air quality that rarely never make it across the finish line. They just don't do it. Even when Republicans run them, they're usually really, really watered down. However, considering the IOC bid and that the Olympics are coming back, there are some stuff they're probably going to need to do to clean up the air, and that might be ran by Tyler Clancy, a very young representative from Provo who tried to do that last year. And another thing that they're bringing back is ICWA, which is a federal piece of legislation that prioritizes placing Native children with biological family members instead of adoptive families or foster care families. That failed to pass in 2023, and they're hoping they can pass it this year. It was a bipartisan bill. Nobody really knows why it died on the floor, but they're hoping they can rally. And then, yeah, I think they're going to go after higher education. What exactly? Unsure, but I think that they're going to do some more of this work on kind of DEI in higher education and perhaps coursework. And then I did hear a rumbling, again, this is like kind of a rumor, they might try and do something with tenure.
Interesting.
Yeah,
Robert, anything to add?
No, I think they kind of touched the big ones. The things I'm most interested in are obviously what they do with the judiciary, whether that's term limits or changing the confirmation process or there's been talk about electing judges, which I think would, meet some resistance, obviously. The higher ed, the speakers asked universities to come up with 10% cuts across the board because he wants to refocus their missions on career training, job training type programs. So that's created a lot of anxiety, I think, in campuses across the state. And yes, I think that the Amendment A getting stricken is an interesting one, because that one would have reformed the tax mechanisms for public ed. And so they will be back with that, but they won't be able to put it on the ballot until 2026. So they may try to come up with a stopgap there. An Amendment D, again, same thing, won't be able to be on the ballot until 2026. So there may be some changes to the ballot initiative process just to sort of stave those off, because you could envision a scenario where we have a slew of ballot initiatives on the ballot in 2026 at the same time as this constitutional amendment. And I think they want to avoid that. So the potential is there for them to make the ballot initiative even more difficult, which it already is pretty hard.
Yeah,
And-
I think
and
that's probably likely.
Another thing, just because I'm a housing nerd, is they'll be taking another stab at housing policy. And I kind of get the sense, I could be wrong, but that there might be more of an effort to get a bit more aggressive than they have in the past. They've kind of chewed around the edges around, encouraging cities to allow higher density housing with a focus on like more attainable single family homes. But I do wonder if they might take a bit more of a step with this recent legislative audit that called for some type of way to allow upzoning or higher density on a wider scale throughout the state. And so that's something that Cox has really got, housing's one of his top priorities, and he's got Steve Waldrop working on that issue, and they've been working through the interim on like a statewide housing plan. And so I'll be keeping an eye on exactly what they plan to do with that, but there'll probably be multiple bills, like a suite of bills, that will be really complicated and fun to unpack.
Yeah. Certainly probably one of the biggest issues facing all Utahns, but particularly younger Utahns, right? So it'll be interesting to see where housing goes this year, especially since we haven't seen a whole lot of movement, at least in my opinion, over the last several years. Okay. I have promised people that I will ask their questions. And so we got a number of them, but I thought that I would start with this one, which several people have commented on. Gerrymandering and maps. What are your thoughts on when these maps will be redrawn? How will they be redrawn? Certainly a lot of speculation there because this is still in the courts and we don't really have a new opinion from the district court on how that's going to happen. And we also don't know if either side will appeal that decision, back up the chain and eventually get to the Supreme Court. But generally speaking, any thoughts on redistricting, how that's going to happen and when it will happen?
I will take a swing at this one, I guess. As you mentioned, the Supreme Court sent the case back down to the district court to decide if the SB 200 that repealed Proposition 4, the Better Boundaries Initiative, or gutted it largely, didn't fully repeal it, but significantly rewrote it, is whether that is constitutional or not, whether the boundaries that are in place, whether the legislature can meet its burden of saying that they had a compelling state interest and was narrowly tailored to override the proposition. It seems unlikely, based on the way the Supreme Court's opinion was written, that they'll be able to do that, which means then the judge can order SB 200 reinstated, and that would require the legislature to redraw the congressional districts. That would then get appealed. And so I think the prospects for having new districts in place by 2026 are pretty slim. 2028, it would be more likely. And that all assumes or presumes that the court rulings go in the direction of the League of Women Voters, the plaintiffs in the case. So the other question that is a little bit more uncertain, I guess, is if the district judge orders the congressional districts to be redrawn and SB 200 to be stricken, does that also mean that the legislature has to redraw the legislative boundaries and the school board boundaries? Because those were not drawn under the Proposition 4 structure either. There seems to be an argument to be made there, but as of now, the court challenges only focus on the congressional districts. So there's a lot of legal proceedings yet to come before we even get to the point of deciding whether or not the new boundaries will be drawn. And so I'm fairly skeptical. And I talked to former Representative Rebecca Chavez last week, and we were talking about the prospects for having new boundaries in 2026. She was the original executive director of Better Boundaries, and she seems pretty skeptical as well that there will be anything in place by 2026.
Yeah.
Also, just one more thing, and the state, as we see with the closely divided U.S. House, the stakes of this are so high that you can bet that there's going to be a huge amount of pushback if we get to the point where boundaries might be redrawn, because one seat is worth a lot of money to these parties right now.
Yeah. Sage, Katie, have you heard anything about the idea of adding state seats, state Senate, state House seats, also school board seats, because that is a big hole in this litigation, right? It only applies to U.S. House seats right now.
Yeah, I mean, I was just gonna bounce off what Gehrke said about, I mean, it's all about how long this will take, this court case, and there's so much that could happen. As far as adding seats, I mean, I think I did see a headline like we're on track to gain, is it one seat? I'm going off of the fly here, guys. Maybe you can help me
I think
out.
it's one seat.
And that's more of a matter of population growth. And but yeah, I think the big thing we're all watching is what ends up with this court case, how long it will take, and if we do get a new congressional map or possibly other new maps, the other question is, well, could the legislature step in and do something else? Maybe do a watered down version of their repeal and replacement of the Better Boundaries thing. So there's so many things that could happen before we actually get new maps, that I'm kind of with Gehrke, kind of skeptical. It's going to take a long time. This is like a very slow process. And to actually see an impact, a drastic impact, it would probably take a long time. So buckle in.
Yeah, Sage, on this, just one more thing on this, and we'll move to another question, but it does seem like in terms of time frame, at every step of the way, the plaintiffs in this case, or people that want to see new maps, are going to meet relatively stiff resistance. And there's still a lot of tools in both the legislature and frankly, other organizations as well. Plenty of tools left for them to keep the process moving as slowly as possible. Any thoughts on time frame from you? I mean, do you think it seems like Katie and Robert both think 2026 is maybe a little bit close. I mean, by the time you get to 2028, 2030, we've got redistricting in 2032.
So I think kind of two thoughts. One, yeah, the probability of this happening by 2026 is incredibly slim. And if the plaintiffs can pull out a W on this and being able to fast track it to 2026, I think they're going to feel pretty good about themselves. Aside from that, I think it's probably going to have to happen before the next redistricting cycle, I would think, just so that can maybe influence what they do the next redistricting cycle. I do think, though, based off what we saw this year with specifically Rosa Mary Lesser likely losing her seat based off what they're arguing is redistricting, we could see an amendment to the case where they do add the legislative boundaries in. I'm not a huge court nerd, so I'm not 100% how that works, but I wouldn't be shocked if they added an additional thing to it. I mean, just as Amendment A being blocked was added to the voucher lawsuit with the student, not the student, sorry, the teacher union, the largest teachers union, education union. But I mean, I think, yeah, like buckle up. Everybody watching, good on you for not having to sit through all these court hearings, because we are. So just,
Yeah.
I guess, look out for our reporting on it, because we will sure be on top of it.
Good. Well, let's move on to another question. We had someone ask about, well, Lorraine Alexander asked, what would be the path to all party primaries? So I'm guessing more of an open primary system and ranked choice voting here in Utah, like they have in Alaska or in Maine. Any thoughts on that?
I'm gonna try and take this one and then let you guys go. I've been following this because this was actually on the ballot in Idaho. Ranked choice voting and open primaries, and it failed so hard. It failed so hard. So while they were able to get it on the ballot, they were not able to garner enough support from the constituents in Idaho. Sorry, somebody is blowing leaves outside of my window.
Can't even hear it.
Good. So I think it's going to be a pretty hard sell in Utah. I really do. But there is a group working to try and get it on the ballot for 2026, I believe. And if they're able to gather the signatures, and then we'll probably see that. But there are people on the ground working towards trying to at least give voters the option for ranked choice voting and for the potential of open primaries. But based off the population of Idaho being pretty similar to Utah, if it failed that hard in Idaho, I don't know. And I don't know if that's going to be a huge driver for Utahns to want to turn out and vote.
Yeah, and I do
think
know
if abortion was on the ballot, then yeah, but
I do know earlier this year there was a bill from Katie Hall to end Utah's like pilot program with ranked choice voting early. That bill didn't pass, I don't think so. But there is an interest in the legislature. They don't like it. There's a fair amount of lawmakers who do not like ranked choice voting. And so I'm with Sage. I'd be surprised to see that make progress. In fact, this session we could see some restrictions on new types of voting method, especially as there's a fair, segment of the Republican Party and Utahns even that grew, especially this election, that have are concerned about election security and concerned about elections and I'd expect some election related bills to probably add some restrictions or increase security, and rather than try new things here in Utah.
Yeah, I think they both hit it on the head. There was a question about the name of the organization Sage mentioned. It's called People for Utah, the number 4. There, she just put it in the chat. I think, yeah, the way to get the changes to the primary system done would be a ballot initiative. The legislature is not going to do it itself, and I think Katie's right. There's a lot of hostility toward ranked choice voting among the legislature because it tends to yield candidates that are more reflective of their constituents, which also means that they tend to be more moderate than the legislature is now, and that's not something that they're eager to see happen. That's where it kind of dovetails with what changes happen to the initiative process. If People for Utah have to go out and get 300,000 votes instead of 140,000 votes, then we, might not see a ballot initiative taking place. I think Sage pointing to Idaho is correct, but I would also kind of put a caveat on there that the primary opposition to a ballot initiative like that right now would be the Republican Party. And right now, the Republican Party is in a bit of disarray because of this divide between the Spencer Cox faction and the Trump Phil Lyman faction, even though Cox, I know, endorsed Trump. But I think there's still a divide in the Republican Party about where they go from here. I've heard talk among Republicans about, further weakening the caucus convention system, lowering the threshold for signatures to get on the primary ballot to try to sort of neutralize the more rabid wing of the party. And so I think, when we're talking about things that might come up during the 2025 session, I think that's something that we're going to have to be watching for pretty closely, because it could turn into, in Utah, it's not so much the Democrats fighting the Republicans sometimes, it's Republicans fighting themselves. And so that's one of those areas where that could arise.
Well, we are a few minutes away from the 1 o'clock hour. Are there any parting thoughts that any of you would like to share before we finish up? Anything that we didn't catch that you want to make sure people know about? Anything like that? We did it. We hit every single thing that we could possibly hit. Great. I'm glad that we did it. Well, I appreciate all three of you being on. You know, Katie, Robert, Sage, as I've mentioned, I am always delighted in your reporting, the things that you have to say and that you have to do. I hope that you know that there are a lot of us out there that view what you do is not only important, but a very, very valuable public service. So thank you. And thank you for being willing to come today and share your thoughts and participate and give us your insights. Your willingness to do this work and keep our politicians honest and keep us informed is very much appreciated. Thank you too to everybody who joined us today. We really appreciate it. Whether you're a regular supporter of Better Utah or you're brand new and this is your first event, we appreciate your willingness to help us out. There should be a donation link. If you want to donate to Better Utah, please do that. There should be a link in the chat. If not, you're always welcome to go to our website, betterutah.org. And thank you, everyone, for participating today. I hope you all have a great day and a great week ahead. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.